The dusk leaned gently over the plains that evening, its bruised lavender light settling on the Boone ranch like an old memory refusing to fade. The wind whispered across the dry earth, carrying dust and the faint scent of pine smoke, as if it knew the house held a story struggling to breathe. Inside, a lone lantern trembled on its hook, sending wavering shadows across the wooden walls as Silas Boone, age 30, pushed open the door after another long day on the trail. His boots carried half the desert with them, and his shoulders bore the heaviness of a man who had spent his whole life outrunning something unnamed. He exhaled sharply, muttering the same words he'd repeated for years, not to convince others but to convince himself. "I'll never take a native woman as my wife." Yet even as the sentence left him, something within him winced, as though the truth behind it had begun to betray him. Across the room, by the small stove where supper simmered, Ayanna Willow, age 20, paused her stirring. Her fingers tightened around the wooden spoon, her knuckles whitening. Lantern light smoothed over her soft features, the long black braids down her back, the warm copper of her skin, the quiet worry in her dark eyes that followed him with unspoken questions. She was his cook, his helper, his shadow in the house's quiet corridors, yet the concern etched on her face tonight felt deeper than duty. Silas caught the look before she could hide it, and something in his chest tightened with a curiosity he'd never invited. He brushed past her toward the washbasin, but every step felt as though he were walking through her worry. He could smell the stew, rich with sage and roasted venison, and he could feel the tension she tried to tuck behind her lowered lashes. When he finally looked up, meeting her gaze in the half-dark, he sensed a shift in the air, the kind that precedes a revelation. Ayanna opened her mouth as if to speak, then closed it again, her lips pressing into a line of quiet resignation. The soft scrape of her boots on the floor echoed louder than it should have, and Silas wondered, why did she seem frightened of her own voice? He set his hat aside, rubbing the dust from his eyes, when he saw it, a faint bruise near her temple, half hidden beneath her hair. His breath froze. "What happened?" he asked, sharper than intended. Ayanna flinched, not from the words, but from the tone. "Nothing," she murmured. "Just clumsy." But the bruise was no accident. It carried the shape of someone else's cruelty. Silas stepped closer, his rough hands hovering near her but not touching. "Who did this to you?" Ayanna turned away, shoulders trembling. "It doesn't matter," she whispered. "It wasn't your burden." The rest of the house seemed to listen with bated breath, as though the walls themselves knew a truth was slipping into the room. He waited, but her silence held steadfast. Outside, thunder low-growled over the plains, making the lantern sway. The air thickened with something unspoken. Silas had spent years building walls out of anger, habit, and pride, but seeing her bruise cracked something he didn't know was fragile. "Tell me," he pressed softer, almost pleading. When she finally spoke, her voice was a trembling feather. "Some men in town said I had no place among decent folks. That working here meant I'd forgotten where I came from." She swallowed hard. "They pushed me. That's all." The simple explanation sliced deeper than any confession. Silas felt shame coil in his stomach, not for her, but for himself. For the vow he'd clung to. For the distance he'd kept. Outside, the storm thickened, and as lightning flickered against the window, Ayanna took a step away from the stove. Her breath hitched when he took a step toward her. For a heartbeat, neither spoke. The silence felt fragile, like two hands almost touching. He reached toward her bruise, the slightest tremble betraying his concern, but he stopped midway, suspended between fear and tenderness. Ayanna's lashes lowered, as if even that near gesture brushed against a wound she'd been hiding for too long. That night, the storm broke open, rattling the house like a restless spirit. Ayanna couldn't sleep. She paced quietly from window to stove, her fingers worrying the edge of her shawl, her ears tuned for the sound of Silas returning. He'd gone to secure the cattle before the worst of the wind hit, but the minutes stretched into uneasy hours. The lantern sputtered as rain battered the roof. She brewed coffee without realizing it, pouring him a cup that grew cold on the table as she watched the door in painful stillness. Each thunderclap made her flinch as though the world might deliver another bruise. When the door finally burst open, Silas stumbled inside, drenched and gasping. Ayanna rushed to him before she could think, her hands grasping his coat, her eyes wide with fear. "You're soaked, sit, please, let me." Her voice faltered only when she realized how desperately she'd reached for him. He stared at her, rain dripping off his lashes, chest rising with wind-stolen breaths. The storm's roar muffled into something softer as she guided him to the fire, her hands steadying him with a care that felt almost sacred. He had been tended to by women before, but never like this, never with such trembling devotion, as if his very existence mattered. "Why are you still awake?" he asked quietly. Her eyes flickered away. "I was worried." His heartbeat thudded once, heavy. "About me?" She swallowed. "You're kinder than you think, Silas Boone. I didn't want the storm to take someone who never let it show he feared anything." The words unsettled him more than the thunder. She draped a blanket around his shoulders. He caught her wrist gently, not to stop her, but because the warmth of her touch steadied something inside him he hadn't realized was trembling. Her breath stilled. The storm rumbled. For the first time, he whispered her name, not as a command, not as acknowledgement, but as something softer. "Ayanna." It came out like the beginning of a confession he didn't know how to finish. In the days that followed, something quiet shifted between them. Silas began noticing her more closely, not just the way she cooked or cleaned, but the small, delicate gestures she tried to hide. The way she folded his blankets at dawn. How she mended his shirts with tiny stitches that must have taken hours. How she hummed soft melodies while chopping vegetables, her voice a balm even when she didn't realize he was listening. Those little songs settled in his chest like seeds waiting for permission to bloom. Yet the world outside their walls remained cruel. Whispers followed Ayanna whenever she accompanied Silas to town for supplies. People stared too long or looked away too quickly. Some murmured that she was trying to snare him, that no rancher should keep a native woman under his roof unless she served a darker purpose. Silas pretended not to hear, but Ayanna heard every word. Shame tightened around her heart like rope. She began keeping more distance, stepping out of rooms when he entered, lowering her gaze even when he spoke her name. One afternoon, when Silas returned from tending the outer fence, he found her folding her small belongings into a worn leather bag. Something inside him lurched. "What are you doing?" he demanded, voice rougher than intended. Ayanna didn't look up. "I should not stay," she whispered. "Your life has grown heavier because of me." Rain began to fall again, the skies echoing the tremor in her voice. She shifted toward the door, her shoulders drawn tight as if bracing for impact. "I don't want to bring shame to your home," she said softly. "You deserve peace, Silas." She reached for the door handle, but he stepped in front of her, blocking the exit. His chest rose and fell as though each breath carried a lifetime. "Don't leave," he said, voice raw, stripped of all the certainty he usually carried. For a moment Ayanna's mask cracked. She looked up, and in her eyes Silas saw loneliness so deep he wondered how she had carried it without breaking. "Why?" she murmured. "Why would you ask me to stay when the world says I should go?" Silas opened his mouth, but the truth tangled in his throat. The words were too big, too new, too dangerous. Instead, he rested his hand against the doorframe near her shoulder, leaning close enough that she could feel his breath warm against her skin. "Because," he whispered, "you make the quiet feel less empty." Ayanna blinked, stunned. Outside, a single raindrop slid down the glass like a tear. In the days that followed, their connection deepened not with declarations but with gestures, soft, uncertain, tender. Silas joined her in chores he'd never bothered with before, slicing potatoes beside her while she pretended not to notice his clumsy cuts. Their hands brushed once, then twice, then stayed a little longer each time. Ayanna hummed again, and though she tried to stifle it when he walked in, He listened with a faint, unguarded smile. Yet fate tested them without warning. One afternoon, Ayanna ventured into the hillside to gather herbs for Silas's lingering cough. Hours passed. The sun dipped. Silas felt unease claw at his chest. When he finally found her, she was collapsed among the sagebrush, breath shallow, skin pale. Fear tore through him with a violence that silenced every doubt he'd ever had. "Ayanna!" he shouted, dropping to his knees. He lifted her into his arms, her head lolled against his chest. As he carried her home, he whispered, "Don't leave me, don't you dare," words he'd never imagined saying to anyone, yet now felt truer than the vows he had once clung to. Back at the ranch, she stirred faintly. "You shouldn't have carried me," she murmured. Even half-conscious, her first thought was him. "I worry for you," she whispered, eyes barely open. "I always worry for you." His breath caught. "You stay awake for me?" he asked. She nodded weakly. Something inside him shattered and rebuilt in the same instant. He pressed his forehead to hers, voice unsteady. "Ayanna, if you'll have me, I want you beside me. Not as my cook, not as someone the world judges, but as the woman I choose above all else." The following days moved like a dream. When Ayanna recovered, Silas asked her to marry him with no grand flourish, only earnest eyes and trembling hands. She said yes with the gentlest smile he had ever seen. They married in the quiet meadow behind the ranch, where wildflowers bowed in the breeze as though honoring a sacred moment. Silas wore a simple vest. Ayanna wore soft deer-hide adorned with her tribe's beaded patterns, each bead sewn with tender intention. Their vows were spoken in soft tones, carried by the wind. "You softened a heart I thought was stone," Silas whispered. "You saw worth in a woman the world cast aside," Ayanna replied. When he kissed her, the plains seemed to exhale. Years later, the ranch still held the echo of that gentle union. Silas would brush dust from Ayanna's cheeks while she stirred stew, and she would laugh softly, her voice still humming those healing melodies. Their love lived like a small fire in winter, steady, warm, impossible to ignore. Sometimes Silas would look at her and remember the night he first noticed her deep concern, and wonder how he ever dared to deny a future that had waited so patiently for him. And if you listen closely, as the wind rushes over the plains and the lantern light quivers at dusk, you might hear their story whispering to you too, a reminder that sometimes the heart recognizes its home long before the mind admits it. Someone, somewhere, might already be watching over you with quiet concern, hoping you'll notice the tenderness they've hidden so carefully, and wondering if you'll let them stay.